and welcome to T2RL Talks Conference Special Edition. And with the T2RL Engage conference less than a month away now, we're talking about distribution. But we're not just talking about distribution from the point of view of the airlines. There are other players whose contribution to airline distribution is absolutely vital. And I'm talking, of course, about the travel sellers. And at the conference this year, we will be having a unique session where we bring together airline distribution experts with representatives from major travel sellers to really thrash out some of the challenges that airlines and sellers alike are facing in modern airline distribution. Participating in that workshop will be Ian Luck, who is the head of T2RL's distribution practice, and a very good friend of T2RL, Mr. Timothy O'Neill Dunne, who I'm sure is very well known to most of the listeners to this podcast. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Good morning.
So, Ian, maybe why do we as T2RL think it's important to bring travel sellers and airlines together in this workshop?
Yes, good to talk about this subject. We think it's really important that the travel sellers are engaged in the conversation, and we really value them attending our conference and talking with the airlines and the vendors that are at the event. Although our kind of core audience and core client set comes from the airlines and the vendors, clearly the travel sellers, if you're talking about distribution, if you're not going to talk to the people who are on the other end of the pipe doing the actual selling and engagement with the customers, you're missing a critical part of the ecosystem. So we really value having the travel sellers and the airlines together, discussing some of the issues that we're facing. And as we move from one kind of big industry change over the last decade, NDC, into the next one, offer, order, settle, deliver, then we think it's really critical that we try to engage the travel sellers and airlines in the same sorts of conversations.
Okay. And Timothy, you've been fairly critical, I think, about the way that the industry in general has gone about introducing new distribution technologies. And I think in particular, the views and the needs of the travel sellers have been insufficiently acknowledged as the airlines introduced NDC and now OSD. Do you think we have a role to play in trying to make sure that happens maybe a bit less in the future and we get better cooperative introduction?
That's a great set of premises that you set up. So I'll start with, yes, I agree with you that it is essential that the entire travel ecosystem, because that's what it is, particularly for the airline product, is at least participatory. And I think that NDC, when it first came out, was definitely unidirectional. Even now, when we talk about offer and order, etc., I still think it's missing a very important quotient, which is the second letter S for service. And I think there's some wonderful opportunity here that the traditional marketplace relies upon the agent seller community to provide that S, the servicing. And I think that's not been well acknowledged, and I hope we can get to discuss that.
Okay. And in terms of the specific issues that we're going to try and tackle with the community in this workshop, one of the big one is the future of travel search and offer generation. And I know that a lot of airlines are beginning to get a bit twitchy now about some of the costs involved in very high look-to-book ratios, which are probably only going to increase. What are your thoughts on that, Ian? Is that something that airlines didn't even see coming when they began the move towards NDC?
I think some did and some didn't. I mean, it's always difficult to describe airlines as a whole group. There's definitely some that have been thinking about this for a while. I think there was a certain amount of unknown information that airlines needed to discover, and there's still, even the most well-informed airlines or travel sellers or vendors today, I don't think anybody knows exactly what will happen over the next 5 years. We might be able to look at the trends and explore it a bit, but certainly this feels like a subject where we need to put our brain power together, and we need airlines to be talking to travel sellers and in different forums as well. We need vendors involved as well, because I'm not sure anybody exactly knows completely the answer to this problem at this stage.
Which is, maybe a little bit scary given some of the numbers involved. We're seeing look-to-book ratios going into the tens of thousands. And when this subject comes up, I always look back to my days in the beginning of Galileo, which is now 30 odd years ago. And the first look-to-book ratio we calculated there was 11. We've moved a long way on from there. So, Timothy, one of the factors that's coming along in search and offer generation is the use of AI. Do you think that's something that we need to factor into our calculations for the future of distribution?
Absolutely. I think there's no doubt about that. The question is, what does A in the AI mean? And I think we should be discussing and looking at that. Is it truly artificial, or is it some combination? Because ultimately we're dealing with humans, and you can't substitute one for the other. If I think back as to when the web first came out, because I'm old enough to remember that, I remember look-to-book ratios did rise significantly then. When mobile came and it was easier for the consumer to generate more queries, that happened. And now here we are with AI, where there is an independent system, let's call it agentic for the sake of argument, which is a machine that will generate as many queries as you want to. I think that the interesting question for me is not really on the cost side, which is more on the revenue side. Will all this ultimately result in increased passengers or increased revenue? And I think that's an interesting question to think about.
Yeah, because if it doesn't result in increased revenue and all it does is drive up cost, then it will have been a resounding failure. And I think we need to do whatever we can as an industry to avoid that sort of lose-lose situation.
I think you're right. There's one consideration is that this is not unique just to travel. Travel just happens to generate large numbers of searches. I think what we should be looking at is, and this is when you said, let's include the vendors in this conversation, it is what could be done to build a robust structure where caching is actually reliable, because ultimately, at the end of the day, it's going to be about trust.
Yeah, I just want to pick up on that point about vendors, and I completely agree. The vendors have to be part of the conversation, but it's important to stress that at this particular workshop that we're talking about, there won't be any vendors in the room. This is strictly for the airlines and their travel seller partners to thrash out some of the issues.
Yes, I mean, we see throughout the conference opportunities to get different groups together. I mean, airlines need to talk to agencies and sellers. Airlines need to be talking to vendors. Vendors talk to sellers, and at some stages, you need all three sets in the group in the room. We sometimes see you get different conversations out of different sort of sets of audience combinations. So we're going to do this particular workshop with airlines and travel sellers, but of course, over the 3 days of the conference, we have lots of vendors present as well, and we encourage kind of everybody to be engaging with all the other stakeholders in the ecosystem.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly right. And far be it to suggest that we don't want to talk to vendors. Clearly we do. But in this specific workshop, this is just the airlines talking directly with their travel seller partners. And as you say, there'll be plenty of opportunity to talk to the vendors in the remaining 3 days of the conference. Let's move on just a little bit. One of the things that has been in the news is still 13 years down the line, the slow adoption of NDC. I think this year we are beginning to see that change, I think. The GDSs are taking NDC seriously. There's quite a lot of growth. There's a lot of new contracts in place. Timothy, you're skeptical about the GDS's involvement, I think. But to my mind, it's been very slow, and I'm not sure there's going to be a sort of hockey stick moment when the curve suddenly goes shooting up to the stratosphere. But I think it's pretty much unstoppable now. The things that the airlines want to do in distribution cannot be done any longer using 1980s technology. Timothy, what do you think?
So, first of all, I think we should all start from the basis of saying that EDIFACT which itself was built on top of telex, which is over 100 years old, is no longer fit for purpose. So that must be a given. And I think that the involvement of the different parties in how we get this to a good state, it is important. I agree with you. I don't think there is going to be a lovely, consistent, either a smooth curve or this famous hockey stick that people have been trying to predict for a long time. The curve is unknown. There are clearly good isolated examples that we could pick on and say this carrier is doing a great job with this group, either enforced or cooperative. But there is no singularity of model that says, yep, it's all going to happen and that's going to be fabulous, boys and girls.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think we see a lot of different parties working hard in different places to try and make this work. Some airlines, as you say, Timothy, have probably made more progress than others. We see initiatives like the Excelia, Sabre, Amex GBT launched NDC Fast Track with and other people participating in that type of. I think we see more collaboration. Sort of every year, we're seeing more collaboration and more entities saying, we're getting to the point this is working, even in the corporate space, which we know is harder than the simple leisure space, although there's also some interesting complex leisure use cases as well. So I think we're making progress. I'm not sure it's going to go from 10% or 20% or whatever the number is today suddenly to 50 tomorrow, but it feels like we're in the right. As you said, it's an unstoppable path, but it's a little bit unpredictable as to what shape the curve's going to take still.
I think there is an interesting aspect, which is that Ian and I have been doing some work recently on how airline distribution splits across various channels. And one of the things that we're very much aware of now is that NDC is not actually the only game in town when it comes to API-based distribution. There are others. The airlines using Navitaire are using largely a Navitaire proprietary API, and that's a big chunk of the market. And again, still not the only one. There are others as well. OpenJAW with the Chinese airlines, for example. So I think it's fair to say that API-based distribution is pretty much unstoppable. NDC is probably the most significant of the APIs, but it's not the only one. And I think it would be interesting in the workshop to get the travel sellers' views on that, and maybe on which of those APIs is most effective for them and which has features that maybe some of the others don't have. So we'll be exploring that in the workshop. I want to talk specifically about servicing, because I know that of all the people I work with, Timothy is probably the most vociferous in calling out the slow progress towards effective servicing in the API-based distribution channels. Are you seeing any light on the horizon on that one, Timothy? Are we actually slowly getting to a workable position?
Oh, I wish I could answer in the affirmative, but I can't. And I think there has never been a full understanding at the extent of technology and human interference that occurs at a TMC or even at an OTA. And God help us with humans at the old traditional travel agencies, what they have to do for service. And when you move from the EDIFACT GDS-based model to a non-homogeneous NDC OOSSD model, there is a lot more servicing that's required, and it's multi-dimensional. So I think that the task is harder, and I also see people forgetting to remember something called data, that because the data that can provide information, and that information can power decisions, it is probably lacking across the board. So I see service and data as both being a challenge and a great opportunity. I just bemoan the lack of progress.
I'd like to offer some green shoots of hope.
Oh, please do. I'm desperate for it. I'm desperate.
I do agree that as always in the airline industry I remember working in airlines in the past, and the people who know this industry know that it's much easier to sell something than everything else that happens afterwards, and particularly if you talk to your revenue accountants and people like that. I think of an airline that we often give the example of United, who's very, very focused on what they sort of talk about omni-channel servicing and enabling customer that booked via a TMC using NDC to manage disruption in their app on the day of service and make sure the TMC can still see, using data as some sort of data flow, see what's happened and have visibility of the change, so that if they then need to make a further change, they know what happened in the first place. I also remember a quote from Kathy Morgan at Sabre saying, NDC servicing should be, maybe not quite yet, but will be better than Edifact servicing. The thing with Edifact servicing is we've had lots of years to put scripts in place to figure out what things don't work, to automate processes, to train lots of people over the years who know all the quirks and know the workarounds and know the fast ways around it. So it's definitely the case that it's been the hardest part of NDC for nearly every airline I work with to make sure servicing works properly. Nearly every airline I work with wants to make it work properly because they don't want calls in the call center. They don't want to slow the process down. But I think it's the hardest part, and particularly in the TMC side or a high touch leisure agency that offers, kind of premium service, it's probably been the biggest challenge. But I do see some green shoots. But I also agree it's probably the toughest part of the whole process.
Okay, and that's actually a really interesting thought, especially the quote from Kathy Morgan. The idea is that over decades, airlines and travel sellers have worked out processes to get around the limitations of the technology. Now we've got a new technology that's actually probably got more capabilities, but we haven't been building those processes effectively yet. That's a premise, and maybe we can test that in the workshop with some of the representatives of the travel sellers. They may or may not agree. The last point that we really want to bring out, and it's a theme of the conference overall, not just this session, is the growing importance of payments and settlements. It's one of the S's, or the only S, depending on whether you're an OOSD person or an OOSD person, but it's the S in OOSD. And I think possibly airline distribution people and airline sales people have not fully grasped the importance of payment and settlement until very recently, but I think the awareness is growing. I suspect that some of our colleagues in the travel sellers are very well aware of it. And I think getting a meeting of minds on how we go forward with payment and settlement processes is another important aspect of this workshop that we're planning to have. Anyone agree, disagree, or just think I'm talking nonsense?
Oh, Ian, of course, but I'll take this one because I think we've reached a point where, in fact, strange enough, I got a question from a journalist in South Africa most recently. And in the question, the journalist actually said, is BSP still fit for purpose? And the question took me aback a little because I had not expected a journalist to at least have thought about that. But it is true. When we talk about payments, we think about the word settle. I actually prefer a slightly different word, which is fulfillment, financial fulfillment, because it encompasses a broader area. And I think we're going to get there. It's just going to take a bit of time to do so. But yes, there is absolutely something that needs to be done here that would bring together the sellers and the airlines, in other words, both ends. Because if there is going to be a transition from who is the merchant of record to who is the merchant of service, the payment side is going to become a differentiating factor.
Okay, Ian, I'm sure you nodding sagely here and maybe don't have a great deal to add.
Well, just very briefly, I suppose. I mean, it's a kind of specialist niche subject. We are bringing more payment expertise to our conference this year with some vendors and some airline people who are kind of responsible for that area. It's a subject in some airlines that ends up a bit, there's somebody in treasury, there's somebody in finance, there's somebody in procurement, maybe there is a commercial person so it's often a subject that kind of gets a bit spread across airlines. And I think it is a subject that some airlines I know have really focused on, but there's definitely other airlines that probably need to think more about this subject, because it's a complex area, and often it's one that gets a bit kind of divided up. So yeah, I think a focus on it is important.
Okay, so those are the 4 areas that we're going to be concentrating on in the workshop. And just a reminder for anyone who is interested in attending, the conference is open to airline representatives. There is no charge for attendance for airline representatives. And we're also very open to more travel sellers joining us. We already have some of the big names in travel selling participating in the workshop, but more are always welcome. The conference is, as I say, less than 4 weeks away now. It's from the 22nd to the 24th of September, and the workshop we're talking about is on the first day, on the 22nd. So we're in a new venue this year in the City of London, in the shadow of St. Paul's Cathedral, and we have a full program of presentations, discussions, and social events lined up. So if you have not yet registered for T2RL Engage, please do so. And I hope to see everyone at the conference. Certainly I'll see Ian and Timothy at the conference, and I hope to see you there as well. But for now, for this special edition of T2RL Talks, I'll sign off, and I'll thank Timothy and Ian for participating, and I'll thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.